joining us today for our third artist talk for Soil to Skin, now on view at Goucher College until this Saturday, March 29th, 2025. Joining us, we have some great artists today. We have Rachel and Say who are joining us, and we might have one or two other artists popping in as well. Originally, Nicole was supposed to join us, but she's unable, so I have a statement to read by her. So let's jump straight into it. Rachel, Say, if you could introduce yourselves and your work, and we'll get to chatting.
Sure. Should I show some slides now with the intro? Would be a good time. Okay, let's see if this works. And I'll make this. Do you see that as just the slide or presenter view?
Full slide.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Guardiola. Thank you for having us today. And I really look forward to speaking to some of the artists that are in the exhibition at Goucher. Just to introduce myself, I'm an interdisciplinary artist, and I'm also a naturalist. And some of the work in the show is actually a new project or work in progress, the Rocky Mountain Cryptoflora. But just a little bit of background, my studio practice at large is mostly analog and digital photography, time-based media, and new media. And I would say my work is kind of experimental. So utilizing mediums often in a way that defy how they're traditionally used, both in the material practices and also as an act of, what's the right word, of kind of breaking with the tradition of that history. So I have a kind of unconventional background between art, science, and technology. So outside of the arts, I worked in sustainable agriculture in sub-Saharan West Africa. So that is dealing with like very extreme desert climates, a very short wet season, working with growing plants. And I've also worked with natural history museums in taxidermy, so preserving specimens for scientific study. And also, I'm going to turn something off for a second. Sorry, my kid's baby monitor was still on. So I've also worked at the New York Botanical Garden as digital interpretive specialist. And I just talk about this background because this experience, or like what a naturalist is going out into the natural environment and collecting and identifying different species and then cataloging them and putting them into collections in order to track the population over time, see how things evolve, see how species are doing and surviving. And in these various positions, I've seen and worked with plants quite a bit, and also had to learn about naming systems, plant taxonomies, working alongside botanists and horticulturists. So this plays a major role in the kind of background for the Cryptoflora project. And another thing about my practice is I'm really interested in science fiction. So I use the fantastic a lot to imagine ecological futures. So the project that's in the exhibition is Rocky Mountain Cryptoflora. And this is a virtual herbarium of potential plants. So future plants that could potentially exist in a post-human landscape. And the project exists as 3D modeled plants. Something I'd like to develop further in the next couple of months is actually using 3D scan or photogrammetry. So going out into the field taking lots of photos of actual species and then creating hybrids of those species through 3D modeling software, creating 3D environments, and also a actual field guide for these. So in the show, I'm using the platform Sketchfab, which is actually used by a lot of museum enterprises to digitize their collections. See if I have some images. So if you go to up to the kind of kiosk there in the exhibition, you're logged into that platform, which is kind of an open source space. You can click and interact with the plants, and then it has all this information in it, which is similar to like an actual field guide with evolutionary adaptations. And the Cryptoflora project, let me just go back, is based on actual vascular and non-vascular plants that are thriving or have evolved over time to the conditions at the Colorado Rocky Mountains. So survival adaptations in response to actual conditions like drought, forest fire, high altitude solar radiation. And this is just a map of this kind of area. So back in 2020, I moved out here for a teaching job and did a lot of hiking in this area, identifying plants and investigating these species that are really almost like alien plants. So these are some of the models. And when you go in to the platform, you have like a fictional or potential herbarium. So for example, the parasitic paintbrush is a hemiparasite in real life, which is an actual term. And that means being able to siphon water and nutrients from other host plants nearby. So this is something that it actually does. And the fantastical plant, in this plant, the arms extend above ground to actually begin to become carnivorous and can capture hummingbirds or other insects that are pollinators during dry season when nutrients or water is unavailable. So they're meant to be interactive. They're meant to be kind of fun and playful and fantastical. And, I often use like humor, beauty, or the fantastic as ways to engage with audiences, to be to kind of invite them in and engage with more complex conversations, I would say, revolving around the environment and wilderness lost. So I'll just stop. I have some other slides, but I'll stop there. Let's see.
This is so cool, Rachel.
Oh, thank you. Let's see. Stop share.
Yeah. So I recently read a science fiction called Semiosis, which is about a sanctioned plant in some alien planet where humans started to colonize because Earth has become uninhabitable. And so they had to figure out how to live with this sanctioned plant. So when you're talking about this like carnivorous plant that comes out and starts sucking moisture from other plants, that this is actually a real thing that we observe in this nature that we have.
Yeah, I find that just like what's already here is enough to kind of imagine the fantastic. What was the name of that book that you mentioned?
Semiosis. I'll put it in the chat. It's a good book. It has a rainbow bamboo that is like super intelligent, and it's only present because it can branch out and monitors humans and give them different fruits. In a way, it's a little bit manipulative creature, and it's interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect segue. Okay, say if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Let me see. Oh, okay. My slide is already up. Oh, I don't know how to move forward with this. Oh, wait.
You hit slideshow at the top right.
Top right. Oh. Wait. I don't know.
On the Google Slides.
Is it a Google slide? But, Oh, wait. Oh, okay. Slideshow. Am I still sharing? Okay, good. Okay. I'm gonna do this so I can see you guys. So yes, my name is Sejong Cho, and it's really nice to be with Rachel and Brooks. And I look forward to hearing Brooks's talk. But Rachel, it's really cool how you're finding this creative drive in the intersection of ecology and art, and translating, beyond what we observe through the scientific perspective of ecological process and converting that to artistic practice. That's really, really impressive, and I'm so glad that you're part of the show. I am gonna, talk a little bit about my practice. I didn't create a special slide. I actually gave a talk this morning for Creative Morning, so I'm gonna just recycle. And the talk was the theme of the talk was parallel lines, and I talked about parallel lines in my life because I thought my pursuit in science and art were like parallel lines, and I assumed that those lines were mutually exclusive and independent. That I didn't think that my scientific pursuit was influencing my art. My art was something that I did separately, but it turns out that's not how life works. And, different passions in my life have a way of entangling and converging. And in a way, the Goucher show that was kind of like a brainchild of the collaborative that I began with Jonna and Elena is kind of a testament to how different passions in my life converge. So I should introduce myself a little bit. So I moved to this country when I was 17, and I had to make a decision because I went to community college when I moved here and had to make a decision whether I'm going to pursue art or science. And I decided to pursue a degree in civil engineering because I thought realizing American dream was to find a stable job and make lots of money and live a stable life. But it turns out that's really not life's goal. And I have aged and gained lots of wisdom, and I have now more nuanced view on what life should be. And I think art has come into my life later in my science career to really enrich and broaden how I should look at my life. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my science because it goes well with what Rachel talked about. Well, Rachel is forward-looking of the future ecological system. The science that I'm doing really was really defined by geologic event that happened like 13,000 years ago. So my research was done in South Central Minnesota, where they grow lots of corn and soybean, not the kind of sustainable agriculture Rachel talked about. It's a very unsustainable agriculture. And growing soybean and corn across like all this like flat landscape that consists most of the Midwest. And that's why they call it the breadbasket of the world, because they produce most corn and soybean that feeds the world. Turns out it has some negative consequences to water quality. Those kind of like industrialized agriculture result in lots of erosion, and that's where Mississippi River becomes muddy. And it has something to do with something that happened during last ice age. Really, when the upper hemisphere of the Earth was covered with continental glacier, particularly in Minnesota and American Midwest, that has a fundamental geology that consists of soft stuff like clay and silt kind of rock. When the Earth was covered with ice, it really flattened the Earth. That's why when you go to Midwest, it's flat. And the topsoil is like clay and silt. And when you drip water on clay and silt, if you've done any kind of ceramics, water just kind of sits there. And that's why Minnesota is nicknamed land of 100,000 lakes, because naturally it's a kind of landscape where water, when it rains, it just sits in the landscape. But that's not good for growing corn and soybean. So this entire landscape was heavily modified with tile drains that when it rains, tile drains that's installed on a shallow subsurface are designed to move the water quickly out of the land. And that means that rivers has to carry much more water when it rains. So the rivers had become more erosive over time as a result of human intervention in the landscape and started polluting water for past many decades. So that was my research. And, my research, I'm going to quickly go through this. My research involved stakeholder engagement. So we work with farmers and local regulatory agency to demonstrate the science that we understand, the process of landscape that we understand, and to work with them to see if we can come up with a consensus on what is the most effective landscape management options that we can put in that, industrialized agricultural landscape to reduce water pollution. So it was a very collaborative project. And, really the bottom line is, so I developed some models. I developed a model called TopoFilter that tracks the amount of sediment that moves through the landscape, and as well as water movement through the landscape. And putting it all together, I developed this model called Management Option Simulation Model, MOSIM. It's a management option that allows our farmers to evaluate different landscape management options and understand the cost and effectiveness in water pollution reduction. But the point I really wanted to get at is that I did a science that was really aimed at solving environmental issues. There are different types of scientific research. There are scientific research that's driven purely by curiosity to better understand the world around us. But the kind of science that I did was a kind of science that applied the understanding of the landscape and the natural processes and try to solve water pollution problems. So my PhD was really doing science with purpose. And I think that really influenced the way I look at art, because I think art is great. I mean, art doesn't have to be anything, but I want to think about art with more purpose, because I think as humanity, we're facing some really awesome problems in front of us with, climate change, water pollution, air pollution, with potentially devastating effects for many people. So I want to see if art can help to address those issues. And I think, I made these paintings on the screen in a series called Extraction, and the top right one of this synthetic island where people dump toxic sediment in Netherlands is part of the Goucher show. But I have 9 paintings like this of the places where humans extract natural resources. Because I look at lots of aerial photographs in my analysis. I do, I use NASA satellite imagery to understand where the pollution is coming from and incorporate it into computer simulation models that can do some calculation that could help decision makers. And looking at those aerial photographs, I'm always struck by how beautiful they are, even though sometimes those are places on Earth where it's inhabitable because of the drastic water pollution or air pollution or soil pollution. But it was a way for me to kind of express myself as scientist who's becoming a painter. So I made these paintings while I was pursuing PhD. My work has changed since then, but this has become a really important motivation for creating the Pellis Terra, the collective that was funded by Grid Fund, and that with collaboration with Liz Faust resulted in the show at Goucher. Yeah, I think I can stop there so that we have some more time for Brooks. But yeah, I'm so glad that we were able to put this show together at Goucher, and a lot of applause to Liz, because we had some ideas of what the show should be, but we didn't really have that kind of curatorial mind. So it was really amazing to see and the realization of all this artist show in one place, and it's I feel like a really important stepping stone to grow awareness of environmental issues through engagement of artists and scientists, because I think that's the only way we're gonna make any changes, because scientists can come up with technical solutions, but people are not gonna implement it. Those solutions don't mean anything. Where artists can really get at people's heart with the different issues. Maybe it doesn't get articulated in a scientific manner, but I think it's really important to open up people's heart. And I think what artists do is that they are agents of changes in culture, and we need to change our culture if we're going to address the environmental issues in any fundamental way. And we have to really address these issues soon.
I really agree with everything you said about that collaborative mindset between disciplines, which is often really difficult to navigate.
Yeah, there's disconnect, definitely, but I feel like I can kind of play the role of ambassador or maybe translator, because I'm in a unique position where I practice science as my profession, but I also consider painting and art as my profession too. So I have this kind of like combined platform, and and I'm not that unique. I mean, there are other people like me, so we just need to find who they are, and work together
to find one another.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. And last but not least, Brooks.
Speaking of that, what we just spoke to, I recently did a project in Brazil, and it was about a kind of an early example of kind of like rewilding, like reforestation, like in Brazil. And so like the product, like I spent a few months there, and it was like this like wonderful collaboration between myself and a biologist and an art historian and an ecological historian. And it was like the most fun that I've ever had, like kind of pursuing a project.
Where in Brazil?
In Rio de Janeiro.
Okay. Yeah, I had a project in Cantareira system that supplies water to Sao Paulo. And our objective was to make nature-based solution, which is reforesting basically. But we have to call it nature-based solutions for investors, to make a case that reforesting is really important steps for water conservation, and that it could have positive return on investment for the people who will flip the bill for reforesting. But that's really cool. I want to learn more about this.
Well, I mean, it sounds almost exactly the same. Like this is a forest called now it's called Tijuca National Forest outside of Rio, but it was like basically they clear cut it for agriculture, and it totally disrupted the water supply for Rio de Janeiro.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, oh, I guess we should replant that so we can have water again.
Yeah, palm trees, plantation forests that actually very heavily water consumptive. Yeah.
So it was a fascinating project, and like I feel like the I don't know what the right word is, the integrity of my work or the kind of like depth of research was just like absolutely not possible without the kind of expertise of these other like researchers,
That's really cool.
And then I felt like I could then provide, as you were speaking to, some element to kind of give voice to that research, that I felt like was so important. But so my practice is started in photography, Like it was, it's a photographic practice ultimately. And what I think about all the time is just like images and how they kind of influence how we see and experience the world. Specifically, like how images kind of mediate our experience with nature and how they have kind of like shaped what we think about nature and our relationship to nature. And it kind of just started out with, you know, I was in high school and I liked Ansel Adams and I wanted to make photos like him, and because I thought they were beautiful. And then I went to UC San Diego, not knowing, you know, barely knowing anything about what that program was about. And it turns out like I had some of the best professors I could probably imagine. And my professors there in photography, especially one named Phil Steinmetz, who was kind of a part of the new topographics movement, like in the 70s. And if you don't know that, it was kind of like a reaction to images like Ansel Adams. And so it was more about showing these kind of like banal landscapes, or landscapes that humans has interacted with or affected in relationship to nature. This kind of like dichotomy, this tension between like nature and culture. And instead of like the value of the beauty, it's more about the specificity of the interactions, like in what we're doing to the landscapes. And so that's kind of like hugely influential to kind of my development. And I think my work really is still just kind of there, and in different forms over the years. I'm in this piece specifically that's in the show. This is called Failed American Utopian Communities from 1776 to present. And the origins of this probably come from my research into kind of like early landscape photography. Like I got really invested into thinking about those like early Western landscape photographers and just like how much influence they've had on landscape photography and how we conceptualize kind of the American landscape and nature in the US. And I was just kind of, I went to the archives in Colorado, and the more I was kind of thinking about that, and the more I was researching kind of like what that project was, what they were doing at the U.S. Geological Survey, and who was making those images and why and where they were going. The more it kind of like made me think about just the kind of systems that like surround these like institutions. If that makes sense. Like, for example, like the USGS was a government organization. The U.S. Geological Survey invested in kind of like, especially in the mid 1800s, like just finding out what was in the West, like what resource do we have, like what is out there, and I think in many ways for economic reasons, and like what can
manifest destiny.
Yeah, exactly. Like what can we use? What minerals are there? Is there gold? Are there forests that, you know, it's very much like an extractive kind of like mindset, but they needed these photographers to make a record of that, to make that visible. And but also these images end up being used almost as if kind of like propaganda for people in the East in order to kind of like, you know, white settlers to move west and colonize this like territory. And that would be like beneficial for like the U.S. government in this kind of expansion, like holding like of the territory. Because I think they were also thinking about like that this was like a tenuous endeavor, that the borders weren't quite like set, and that they could be invaded by like other countries still. But So it kind of, but it, I mean, the piece that we're seeing now is kind of coming from those thoughts, coming from these ideas, coming from this place of like thinking about the United States as this place that has had lots of ideas and ideologies like placed upon the landscape, and it's always, since its kind of origins, it's been this place of like that's been highly symbolic of like possibility, and specifically for, you know, like communities looking for this place to kind of like start over, to like invent this kind of structure in society. And like those, you know, those, I think those early landscape photographs from the USGS like speak to that. Like they're often these like big, beautiful, like empty landscapes, right? But I think they're of course like not empty. Like the landscape is not empty. Like the landscape has been used by an indigenous people for thousands of years, but the photographs portray the landscape as such, very much maybe in like a false way. And so that kind of like started me thinking about these kind of like what ideologies are embedded in landscape images that maybe we don't quite think about in an obvious way. And so that got me working with like stock images. And so that the images themselves are me kind of like searching utopia in like the Shutterstock search term. And so I was pulling these images of these kind of like lush places that are, you know, that you will find when you search like the word utopia, and kind of starting to think about like, well, as like that these stock image websites and this kind of search terms, or Google search even, are this kind of like distillation of a kind of like ideology that we might have. So then I was kind of applying those like similar ideas, these thoughts, to thinking about like what is the American landscape, and what are all other ideologies kind of like embedded in it, and thinking about it as this place of like that it has been this place of hope and possibility and desire to reform society, having religious communities come here and wanting to practice their very specific like religious practices. You know, communists from France in the mid 1800s that move here and want to start this like society based on this person's idea. You know, like again and again, you have these kinds of examples, and I think that so I kind of listed them all out. There's two prints on top of each other. That's the same, and then I laser cut the top layer with the names of these utopian communities, all the utopian communities that I could find, and that's mounted on the other like full photograph like behind it. And so I was thinking about these utopian communities, and this kind of like sense, so it's called failed utopian communities because it was also like really striking to me, I guess, like of just like how many communities have come here, and then like what happens to them. And so in the research, it's like there's a trajectory to all these communities where there's like this desire, this optimism, and then when it actually becomes like material and real, and the rubber meets the road, like you see a kind of like very similar disintegration or conflict between a lot of these communities that are based on like maybe an interaction with the landscape. Maybe it's like you are unable to shed those kind of like ideologies that you brought with you, which may be sexist or racist or whatever, like how labor is distributed. Like these communities have to exist in a place they have to exist somewhere, and they exist within capitalism. They have to pay a mortgage on the land, you know. They can't they couldn't have farmed all the food that they needed, so they would have to have another job to then go buy food that they didn't have, like those kinds of things. And like, for me, it was also this, I don't know, the reason that I made this ultimately is like, it was a little bit of like this desire to find a community that was successful and an inability to do so, if that makes sense. Like, that it was a kind of, that I felt saddened, I guess, at the end of the day, by the fact that that nothing, no like community, like outside of capitalism, outside of the kind of structure of the US government, could like be successful. And so, and it seems also like it's an ongoing kind of search also. Like I also see the politics that we see play out presently, as like, there are lots of people that trying to create their ideal like society, like, still, you know. But then what happens when you don't have a West to go to? What happens when you don't have territory to move to? What happens when we all have to deal with the space that we have now, and resources are running out? And so I think about all those things when I was making this.
That was really cool. And I am sorry that I glossed over the people I worked in Minnesota, because Minnesotans, they are descendants of Swedes and Norwegians. That's why they have that funny accent.
Yeah, sure.
And when they emigrated from their country to come here, all the East Coast territories were occupied by English and Germans, so they had to go further west.
Right,
and they settled in Minnesota, and they saw something familiar, you know, climate-wise. But what they brought was their work ethic and the technology for tidal trains that allowed them to drastically change the landscape. They probably thought it was like a great solution. They can drain the landscape and grow crops. What could go wrong? And, you know, 200 years later, it has funded PhD students like me to research how to solve water pollution that's caused by agricultural practices. So that's really funny. And, you know, I think their story is continuing, because they are the descendants of those early settlers in Minnesota. And I am proud that, you know, I was able to work with those farmers, and they were willing to listen to scientists. So I think it will take that kind of back and forth to create the utopia. I think it's a work in progress. And another thing I want to say to you, Brooks, is that I work for U.S. Geological Survey.
You did?
Yeah, I am currently working at U.S.
That's so great.
And you're completely right. In the beginning, with John Wesley Powell, you know, being that explorer going west, was really to fulfill that manifest destiny. And last year, I taught a class at MICA for landscape painting. And this was my first time ever teaching at an art school. So I kind of like created a syllabus that's very different. And I wanted students to think about what landscape means and redefine landscape painting. And I had them read William Cronin's Troublewood Wilderness, that talks about the dichotomy between culture and nature, and the fundamental, you know, the cultural perspective that puts humans against nature in opposite poles is, you know, that's really hindering our efforts to address environmental issues. So we have to change that, the framework. And I think, you know, this kind of conversation is a way to like rethink how we see the landscape, and that will build towards more sustainable relationship with it.
Yeah, I think this definitely draws parallels between like the monetization of land, of natural resources, of human bodies, who has the right to be in wilderness space or the right to investigate the unknown or feel like they can go and discover the unknown is really only accessible to a few in American history. And that draws that continues into this contemporary moment. Some of the things that you were talking about with land use, and it's definitely something I like think about in my work, imagining like non-anthropocentric futures. Like what would it be like if it wasn't so human based mindset?
Excellent. Fantastic comments. I guess I have, so we have about 20 minutes left. So if you're watching, feel free to, ask a question in the comments, whatever platform you're on. But I think I have one final kind of question for all of you as we're hitting these different points. So all three of you kind of work with iconography, semiotics, whether it's specific place or studies or stock images. So with this iconography in mind, how then do you balance and describe the role of storytelling with that iconography in the narrative, in the work, and in your practice at large?
I mean, I think it's fascinating, this whole storytelling thing. Yeah, I don't know. Somebody else go first.
I would say like my work's very inspired by science and speculative fiction, and something that I really draw from that genre, whether it's literature or visual art or filmmaking, is utilizing constructive narrative or the fantastic to imagine like what ifs, like what if something was a little bit different or alternative futures, or imagine what it looked like way back in the past. So like a narrative as a way to really like using narrative or allegory as a way to for different individuals to utilize creative media to reflect on contemporary issues in which that was made. So being kind of like a channel to like safely critique or comment on things that are happening. So you can look at different examples like in literature. So that's something I use a lot in my practice. And I would say in terms of like using different content, like the Cryptoflora project is like all original content, but I'm very much like pulling from different naming systems in plant taxonomy and like the way that science creates categories or describes certain things to like invent something new. And that very much comes from this idea of like, for me, like a chimera or a hybrid. So a chimera being this like originally like a Greek creature that's composed of different types of animal parts. And that's like a monstrosity. So something that's not naturally occurring, but it actually does occur naturally. And like the idea of the monster or this alternate creature or being a hybrid of different things that don't go together. So that exists in my photo work with like photo montage, or if I'm doing collage, like taking different elements from different things and piecing them together. And even with this new project, the Cryptoflora, I'm taking different pieces or different ideas or different naming systems and constructing something new.
Maybe I'll just say in terms of storytelling, like it makes me think about just like what's the story that we tell ourselves about the United States, about like what's the story that we tell ourselves about our history and how we got here and why things are the way that they are, because I think at the end of the day it's totally a story, right? Like that, and that that history is a story told by certain people from a certain perspective. That maybe like an indigenous people in the United States have a different story to tell about that history. And so maybe in thinking about these kind of the utopian communities, or the desire for a utopia here, there's a whole bunch of narratives that are like intersecting, and I'm interested in kind of thinking about what all those narratives are.
Yeah, and I'll add to what Rachel and Brooke said, because there have been many narratives in human history, and sometimes science has been used to create those narratives. Like Brooks have used the example of U.S. Geological Survey and Bureau of Land Reclamation, like using scientific information to create narrative of need for Western expansion. And in many ways, through science, there's this kind of deterministic storytelling, where in art, it's less deterministic. There are rooms for the minds of the artist and the audience to mingle and create something that's hybrid. Maybe it's a monster, like Rachel said, but that I think that's really cool. And I was reminded of this story by Primo Levi. He was a Holocaust survivor, writer, and chemist. So he kind of treaded this role between scientist and artist. He wrote a short story called, it's in Italian, it's Questio di Centauris. It's about centaurs. Centaurs are hybrid, and this story is essentially about hybrids. And I think in a way, many people in our show at Goucher are kind of hybrids, because we need to really tread the scientific and art discipline to communicate this environmental issues that have not been communicated through other narrative means. So yeah, I think that wraps it up nicely, and I'm gonna put it in the chat. So
yes, indeed. And I think this is a perfect time to show some exhibition images, and then read a short statement from Nicole, who could not join us tonight for her talk. And I think her statement kind of sums up everything we've been talking about so far. So this is from Nicole Salimbene, and her piece, which is the photo negatives, the kind of receipts and water tubes and chairs beneath it. And you can see Brooks in the background and Elena here as well. Quote, this is from Nicole: "We Are Water," the name of the piece, is constructed out of previous sculptures, disassembled and reimagined here. This act is an exercise in non-attachment, letting go of existing work, allowing it to flow into its present form. The test tubes, which line the bridge or table, depending on how you call it, hold water collected from creeks, rivers, lakes, and oceans from previous installations. They also hold the Colorado River, collected over a summer as I traveled its path between California and Colorado, which is a great connection to your piece, Rachel. In the spirit of reciprocity with this river, I asked myself, what could I possibly give back as I collected these small samples? How could I show my love and gratitude? As a small gesture, I began reading to the river a blessing by the poet John Donahue in praise of water. I hope participants sitting here will also become curious about ways of sharing an act of love with the water within and around them. Further contemplating ways of communing and communicating with unseen and unseen, I wanted to pull attention to the crossing of a bridge. This took on the construction of the bridge/table, which you see here, sitting between two chairs. The three openings in the sculpture are crossed by a woven fabric of receipts bound with wire. They are materials of a previous tapestry work, as you can see here. which explores the hidden nature of consumption. They reference the complexity of our habits as consumers, provoking inquiry around how we hold and behold our responsibility and interdependence on the planet. The illuminated canoe shape floating above was created by hand stitching my photographic negatives, part of an earlier work, Knowing Your Water. Juxtaposing the test tubes signifies science and research, with the photographic negatives signifying the emotional intimacy of memories, emphasizing the ways in which we study our interconnectedness. Ultimately, We Are Water invites viewers to sit at the bridge/table to reflect on their relationship with water and to consider what are the personal, political, historical, and sacred relationships held with water. In the slow stillness of contemplation, what surfaces and integrates. Any final closing remarks from everybody? Any questions you have for each other as well?
Oh, I just had a kind of, maybe I guess a really, well, see, John, I would love to just talk to you for a long time about your experience at the USGS, but Rachel, I had just like maybe a really basic question, and I'm sorry if I missed this, but I was interested, about what you were saying about this plant that extracts water from other plants, and but it got me thinking about like the ways that what I read about just like how mushrooms like interact with other trees and plants like in the forest, that interaction is maybe a more like communal interaction where they're like sharing like nutrients, water and nutrients, but this is not the case with this particular plant, right? This is like an extractive action.
You're muted, Rachel.
Sorry. Yeah, so the project's looking at, I would say, or like focusing in on native plants. So Colorado Rocky Mountains have some really diverse different biomes in it. So some plants that are actually you don't find like anywhere else in the world. So I was really interested in investigating the survival adaptations of those plants in particular, but then also like noxious plants or things that are deemed as invasive and what that means. So the paintbrush is not like an invasive plant, but I was looking and doing a lot of research on like the paintbrush, like what is an actual like hemiparasite. So it has these like nodes on its roots that do extract nutrients and water from nearby plants, and that can actually like increase the diversity of the other plant communities in the environment. But I'm imagining a future, particularly in this area, so that's along kind of like the Front Range. So an area where there's already a very much reduced amount of waterfall every year. Like water is a huge problem in this area, like Colorado River. So east of the Rocky Mountains. So I imagine in the future it's going to be even worse and even less water than it is, so that the plants that are there would have to like utilize their adaptation skills, or like imagining the adaptations in the future. So I imagine these roots, and this is where like the fantastic comes in, like the roots come above ground and almost become like arms. So the primary pollinators for this plant are hummingbirds, because they can see the color red, and it's this like really scarlet plant. But insects don't see red, and then the actual plant only has like the lower lip on the actual flower part of it has like these bracts, but which are actually leaves, but the actual flower part doesn't have a place for a lot of insects like bees to land. So the future plant would have this long lower lip where the bees can actually land, and then we'll do that as well. So it's like you know, when it goes into the dry season, would and if it had to, it would consume its pollinators as a necessary survival adaptation. So a little bit like silly and fantastic, but I think it's a fun tool to just like imagine like, oh, what is real and what is not here, what is possible. Yeah.
That reminds me, you know, Colorado River has historic low flows now.
Yeah.
But there are agreements among states to extract certain amount, regardless of flow.
It's very political.
Yeah. So Nevada is still extracting same amount as if water flow level is the same and building new housing projects.
And there's golf courses everywhere.
Yeah. And they're not adapting while it's amazing the plants that you're describing are adapting to the changing climate where humans, even though we have all the tools, are not adapting.
Yeah, I would say my like post-human future is the world will be a better place. I don't know if that's like a nihilistic point of view from a human perspective, but I imagine it being probably a good thing.
And it looked like Brooks' work.
And it will return to utopia.
Yeah, post-human.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting note because I think, Jong, you mentioned this also, like looking back into the past. I often imagine like what if the future would look a lot like how it was before we were here. And that maybe is a utopian idea, like constructed in our psyche somehow.
Hard to tell.
I think that's a good note to end on.
We have no solution, but we're working towards it. It's going to take a lot of imagination and creative force to create a utopia, or at least sustainable future.
Mm-hmm.
Brooks, do you think utopia is possible?
I'm going to say yes.
Positivity. Awesome. Well, audience-wise, thank you guys for joining us. And a reminder, Soil to Skin ends at Goucher College this Saturday, March 29th. And it will be open 11 to 4 p.m. So stop by before it closes. And if not, hopefully it will travel soon. More details coming. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you, everyone.
Yes.